Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Devils Rink Report with your host, New Jersey Devils reporter James Nichols, here via New Jersey Hockey Now. Happy holidays, everybody, and happy Boxing Day. We have the World Juniors starting today. Not too much for us to talk about on that front with as far as Devils prospects because, well, all of their good prospects have graduated and they're now NHLers. Simon Nemec, Luke Hughes, even James Casey are professional hockey players, I should say, at this point. So the Devils have one player over in the World Junior Tournament right now, which is Kasper Pikkarainen. He's playing for Team Finland, and he's a former third-round pick a couple of years ago. And that's really it. That's where it starts and ends for the New Jersey Devils over at the World Juniors, which has begun today between Sweden and oh gosh, who's even playing right now? It's Sweden and Slovakia. So one interesting note on that, it's kind of quasi Devils related, is that Simon Nemec's brother is playing in the tournament, Adam, for Slovakia. So if you're interested, you could tune in there. I believe it's on NHL Network, TSN, wherever you can find your World Juniors content. But thank you so much for joining in today on Friday, December 26th, the day after Christmas. And as we said, it is Boxing Day. So we're going to do things a little bit different today. Typically, we, filibuster a little bit, some news and notes, but we don't have any news and notes today because the team has been off for a couple of days. But today we're going to just get into the full-length notes on the past couple of games, some bodies back in the lineup. Then we're going to get to our interview with Steve Werier, former AGM of the Florida Panthers, which we've already had, by the way. We couldn't get him live. It just didn't work out with times for him. But we had a great interview with Steve. He provided some excellent insight on, just some behind-the-scenes stuff with the, managerial role that he was in and, how some processes work and, what the what Tom Fitzgerald is up against right now in terms of how he's handled his roster and such. So stick around for that. It'll be we'll be playing that in a few short minutes here after we go through our initial notes, and then of course we're gonna get to the best part of the show, the part that you guys always love to contribute to behind the scenes. Sean will provide us with some of the best questions you guys provide via the chat. So just be sure, even right now, as you're listening to this, if you want to ask a question, be sure to get it in there, get it in early, and we'll probably get it to it sooner rather than later. If you're one of the first questions in, you'll be one of the first questions read. So be sure to drop your comments in the chat below, or to the right of me, I believe. Right, it's over. Nope, this way. This is my left, your right. Be sure to drop the questions in the chat if you have them. And we will be sure to answer them a little bit later on in the show. So let's get to some of the news and notes. Well, not really the news and notes like we typically do. Let's just get to some of the notes overall that we've seen from the Devils in the past few. I guess it's been a week now, right? So the Christmas holiday break is here, but just before we got into the Christmas holiday break, we had a miracle. All three of Jack Hughes, Timo Meier, and Arseniy Griciuk returned to the lineup. And even though we know what happened on the ice, it was certainly a welcomed development, something that, we had been waiting for a while, because before those three guys, were back, you were looking at, I saw a lot of comment on, X about, oh, this is Utica Devils North. I'm sorry, South, because Utica's a little bit more north. This is an AHL team on NHL ice. And listen, I get it, with all the bodies that were in the lineup when those guys were out, your Angus Crookshanks, who, by the way, I think held his own, Xavier Perrant, who I thought was just fine, Juho Lammikko, who actually stepped up a little bit, but look, they're not going to bring what, Jack Hughes, Timo Meier, and Arseniy Griciuk bring, right? So it's great to see everybody starting to get healthy. Having Jack back is obviously a game changer. Although, again, we're going to talk about what the results were, before the holiday break. But look, he's not taking any face-offs just yet. So that tells you all you need to know about his hand right now. It was Dawson Mercer taking the face-offs for him in game one. And then they had a rotation of guys in the second game before the holiday break. So Jack is back. That's great news. What's not great news is that they still have a scoring problem, especially at even strength. 7 goals in the last 5 games, one in the shootout. Goals in the last 5 games were 2, 2, 2, 1, 1. I mean, you're seeing a trend here where they're really struggling to get goals. Palatnes and Cotter, Glendening, Lamico have provided little to no depth offensively. Cotter had a nice little streak there. He's gone cold since. Um, and the thing is, they're taking up a large portion of the salary cap, which is hindering them and what Tom Fitzgerald can do on the trade market. I mean, it's a bit, it's a bit jarring to see what is happening to the scoring here because again, we all like to joke about, oh, what is depth scoring? That meme that you have all floated around out there about Tom Fitzgerald asking that question last summer and seemingly thinking he addressed it. It just has not worked out to be that way right now. Other high paid players like Hamilton, Bratt, Luke Hughes, they've been underwhelming. One of the things is, I spoke to Bratt with a couple of other media members the other day about like, hey, what's going on with you here? Like, are you up against it right now? Maybe is there an injury that we're not, privy of or anything right now that is, hindering your ability to put the puck in the net? And it just seems like a confidence thing right now, and not just him, the team as a whole, but everyone's second guessing themselves. I mean, he had a wide open net against the Islanders. He had Rittich dead to rights in his positioning, and just didn't lift the puck over his pads, and he opted to just sail the puck through the crease. So it was a bit jarring to see that. I mean, look, you see everything else he's doing with the puck and even away from the puck. Jesper Bratt is a really good all-around player. He can transition really well, he can distribute really well, and he's still collecting his apples and stuff like that. But he hasn't scored in like 23 games, or he has 1 goal in 23 games, I should say, rather. So it is certainly, a point of emphasis right now with in regards to higher paid players who are not putting the puck in the back of the net. And Sheldon Keefe did try to get him going, put him back with Jack Hughes after that first game where it was Gritsik and Mercer playing with him instead. And look, he had his chances, but nothing really fell for him. So you want to see guys like Bratt, Luke, and Hamilton certainly contribute more than they are because a guy like Hamilton, we're talking about a guy who we think has vetoed a trade not once but maybe twice. And he's doing nothing to help his trade value. So it's really tough to see with Hamilton playing the way he is right now as well. And if you read my article the other day, by the way, my new 10 observations that I'm going to be doing after, I think, every game, after I put the gamer out, just the who, what, when, where, and why. My 10 observations post, you'll have read that I'm not there with all of the Luke hate right now. I understand wanting more out of a $9 million player, but I think it's a bigger picture when it comes to him. Yes, he's making $9 million. It's the first year of his deal. A couple of factors there. I mean, look, he missed all of training camp. Is that on him? I mean, it really depends. We have a little bit later on from Steve Werier about players in the restricted free agent years missing training camp for holdout purposes. But, he missed training camp and he certainly needs to be a little bit better, but he's also being asked to do a lot, and he was being asked to do a lot out of position at one point too. So I'm giving him, a little bit of leeway here. I don't think necessarily that he is, completely at fault. Point all fingers at him. So, um, just looking at another narrative that we're seeing out there that Fitzgerald has turned I believe the term was Colorado East, and now they are Toronto South. I mean, it's a great analogy. I understand it completely. But I don't think that it's necessarily, they're treading water in the hopeless area, right? There's time to fix this roster and give it what it needs. It's just a matter of being able to do that, which again, we get into a little bit later with Steve Werier. All right. So just a real quick reminder again, if you have questions and you want them answered later in the show, just be sure to drop them in the chat this way, right to my left, your right. Drop those questions in chat, and we will get to them later in the show after we speak with Steve Werier. One of the things I wrote in that 10 observations article is that this team needs more garbage goals. And what I mean by garbage goals is, look, they're creating their chances, right? They're getting shots on net. What they're not getting is they're not getting garbage goals. And that's somebody planting themselves at the top of the crease or on the flank of the goaltender and picking up and burying a rebound. In that Islander game, I saw a number of times that a shooter shot to the far pad and created a decent rebound that could have been collected and scored on. But after the goal that was scored by Brett Pesce, No one was doing that. No one was parking themselves in front of Rittich. And look, Rittich played great that game. He had 3.54 saves above expected, if I'm not mistaken. And he was excellent. But there's no reason why the Devils couldn't have scored another goal or two just by collecting a rebound and scoring. But that's one of the things that this team probably needs. And Timo Meyer is a guy who does that. Dawson Mercer is a guy who's supposed to be able to do that. They're playing on the same line. So if they're not getting those chances, which they created the only goal, by the way, the other night when, Nico Hischier fed Brett Pesce in the slot. But again, Mercer is a guy, Meyer is a guy, but look at Andre Palat. Look at his skill set. He should be doing that kind of thing too. He should have more goals than he does. I mean, he's on pace, like we said last week, for the lowest goal scoring total he'll have in his career since he was a rookie so far. So he definitely needs to step things up a bit in that department. And you would like to see maybe him transform his game, winning battles in front of the net. Look, he does the things on the wall. He wins his board battles. He wins his puck battles, and he does sort of help in that area. He does all the quote unquote little things the right way. But there's no reason why he can't get to the offensive zone and change some of those habits that he has, get to the dirty areas a little bit more, win those battles in front of the net a little bit more, and deposit some of those rebounds. Turn into a Corey Perry. Look at the way that he's elongated his career. They call him the worm for a reason. He's just making it happen well into his 40s. And, the reason why he makes it happen into his 40s is because he's transformed his game a little bit. Is he the 50 goal scoring duck player that he was back in the day? No, certainly not. Is Palat going to be the 25 goal scorer he was with the Lightning? Certainly not. But one player in Perry has adjusted his game, whereas the other player in Palat has not done that yet, at least offensively. So you'd like to see him, be a little bit more open-minded in terms of planting himself in front of the net and winning those battles and depositing pucks. All right, so Jacob Markstrom in that last game, by the way, looks to have found his game. In his last 5 games in all situations, he's got a 923 save percentage, and that's actually above league average. 9 goals against on 12.73 expected goals, 3.7 goals above expected. So, I mean, that's a really good little run there for Markstrom, and you want to see more out of him in that area. If you take out the 12-11 Tampa Bay game, 954 954 save percentage and 6 goals against in the 4 other games. I mean, he looks a lot stronger than he did, before he was injured and then he became injured. And it's one of those things, like I said, a couple shows ago, he does take a little bit to get going, and then he got going. After that, when he was playing last season, unfortunately got hurt around this time. It happened earlier this year. He was hurt earlier in the year after he already wasn't going well, and now you're just seeing it take him a little bit longer to get going. And now it looks like he might have. So it looks good for Jacob Markstrom in that department. You just hope that he can keep that consistency. Big factor. Jacob Markstrom was in the wins over Ottawa and Utah. So that's important. In front of the Canucks, the Devils were really lifeless. And, they had some ugly play in the game with the Islanders on the Simone Holmstrom goal. And that was one of the things. I mean, he was a factor there. And one of the things with him is like he he's his own worst enemy in that department, I guess, because, excuse me, he just, tried to, I guess, make a play, and it wound up, going against him. He hit I think he hit Jonas Siegenthaler, if I'm not mistaken, and it wound up going into the back of the empty net because Holmstrom was able to just pick it up, and put it in the goal, which is something that you don't want to see. I got a tickle in my throat. I apologize. So, all right, there is no excuse for that play, by the way. Like, look, he said it himself. Like, it was just an unfortunate circumstance, and something that he could not control. He tried to make the right play. Obviously, I mean, he could control it. I mean, he says he couldn't control it, but he could control it, make a better play, make a smarter play, maybe stay in the net. But it was certainly disappointing to see. All right, so just looking through my notes here. Let's talk about the roster freeze. That is over on the 28th. So that will be lifted in 2 days on Sunday. So will there be moves? I mean, we'll see. One of the things about whether or not the Devils are going to be able to make those moves is if they are able to, get somebody to agree to waive a no move clause. Um, I don't know that there are conversations happening over the holiday break. They may be happening. I don't know if they're allowed to happen. Honestly, I'd have to check on that. I apologize, guys. This tickle is actually destroying me right now. But we'll see. They're currently 390K over their salary cap, and they're going to need some space for when Jonathan Kovacevic comes back. So we will see. Sean, let's take a pause here. I think it's a good time to bring in Steve Werier. So we pre-recorded this a little bit earlier today. Enjoy the interview with Steve Werier, and we will be back right after to answer your questions. Okay, joining us today on Devils Rink Report is former AGM Steve Werier, former AGM of the Florida Panthers a couple of years back. Steve, how are you? Thanks for joining me.
Hey, James. Happy holidays. How are you?
Good, good. How are you? How was your holiday?
It's good. It's been going good.
All right, awesome. I appreciate you hopping on. We were off camera talking a bit about how we have young kids and hard to make these schedules work, but I do appreciate you hopping on and making this happen. So, Steve, before we get into some nitty gritty here, obviously the Devils, are where they're at in the standings right now. They started well, but they are kind of crumbling here a little bit. Some roster construction questions, some health questions. But before we do that, Steve, why don't you let the listening audience now know, just a little bit of your background, obviously a former AGM of the Florida Panthers, but just a little bit of, what you did when you were working in your time in the league.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my background as a lawyer, as a corporate lawyer, and when I came into Florida, in hockey ops, it's sort of the wide range of work, ranging from managing the salary cap, contract negotiation, but also player evaluation and working with scouting and R&D departments and folks like that to sort of get us up to speed and try to be innovative and do some interesting things. So yeah, sort of same role as most of the AGMs you probably hear about.
Any key players come to mind that you were, had a hand in and maybe, reeling into Florida or having a part in that contract negotiation?
Only one Conn Smythe winner, but Jonathan Marchessault would come to mind.
Very nice.
Signed him in the summer of 2016 to a couple year deal. But yeah, proud of the long-term extensions for guys like Barkov and Ekblad, who are still there now on their next deals, but won a cup on their first ones, and also a couple other long-term deals that aged pretty well. I think in hindsight, including guys like Jonathan Huberdeau, Vincent Trocheck, and Riley Smith. So yeah, really fun, exciting times.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's funny. I do see some parallels between Florida and New Jersey, and that's who we're here to talk about today, right? The New Jersey Devils. And let's just start here, Steve. As a former AGM, you still have your pulse on what's going on around the league. Look, Devils fans are hot for Fitzgerald right now. They want him to fall on his sword. They're not necessarily thrilled with the body of work on the ice. Of course, when you go through struggles like you are going through right now, there's a lot of questions about roster construction and such. Do you have any insight or maybe what the league perception is, on the league side of things, of the perception of Tom Fitzgerald? What do the other 31 GMs think about him, or what is the perception of executives around the NHL on Tom Fitzgerald?
Yeah, like listen, I can't speak to what sort of other people think about him. I think there's different people have different views of everyone. That's not about Tom. Tom, I think as a person is very well liked and exceptionally well connected. He's one of those guys. If you do like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, you get like 2 degrees of Tom Fitzgerald, and probably can get to everyone, past, present, and future in the game. Which is a good attribute, honestly, to be running an NHL team, to be able to have those relationships ingrained and be able to pick up the phone and sort of get anyone to answer. So, yeah, listen, the Devils have been relatively successful the last few years, right? Sort of perennially playoff team, a team that most would have thought could contend most years. And if you're looking at sort of who a person surrounds themselves with, which I think is a good barometer for an executive in anything, whether it's business or hockey. Tom surrounded himself with pretty smart folks, on the cap side, and he's had, Matt Kane with him for a number of years, and I think Matt and Tyler Dello, who's now with Carolina, were both, with Tom in Jersey for a while, and those are sharp guys who have done well. And in terms of, this season, listen, it's a strange year. You got a lot of teams who are in surprising spots, good or bad, and we'll see how it shakes out. And, I know from my time running a team, people love to say no excuses, but when, your franchise player misses 20, 30, 40 games and then has to come back and recover. And I had that one, in 2016, we had Jonathan Huberdeau tore his Achilles in a preseason game against the Devils while I was sitting with Fitzy and Ray. And then, Sasha Barkov missed 50 games on top of that. And we sort of had to throw our hands up in the air if we didn't do it publicly. And listen, the Devils are a deep team, and it's nice. Jack is back, I believe I saw, so he's actually back too. So, see how they do with a healthy roster. But, I'd say most people would say, Fitzy's done a fairly decent job over the years relative to others.
And do you share that opinion of the roster construction, that he's done a decent job of putting this team together? Like, do they have, and again, you were part of, some of the early goings of this current, Panthers regime, where they have the Barkov, the Kachucks, and just how they've won 2 cups back to back, that they're the reigning champions. Do you see parallels between the Devils and the Panthers, and how, maybe, or how far off do you think this team might be from contending for a Stanley Cup? Could they still do that this season? Just what are your thoughts there as the parallels that you might see?
Yeah, I think like one parallel is, and we talked about this, like when you have a franchise cornerstone like Sasha Barkov, that it's not like it's something you can't go trade for most of the time, and the same goes for the McDavids and the McKinns of the league, and Jack Hughes as well. So you got that cornerstone to build on, and my view is like there's one-way door and two-way doors when it comes to player acquisition and contracts, right? Like a two-way door signing is a guy you might sign for 2 years at $3 million, and if he doesn't work out, it's like, all right, you can trade him, you can buy him out, you can let the clock run. It's not going to necessarily derail your franchise long term. The one-way doors are those big ticket long-term contracts to players you almost always acquire through the draft and can't otherwise acquire. And Florida had that. We had Barkov and Ekblad, who were both hits, and Huberdeau, who was eventually monetized off the deal I signed him to in his final year for Matthew Tkachuk, who was similarly is like a lottery caliber player like Sam Reinhart. So it boils down to, for Jersey, I think, you've got 3 of those players under contract, at least in what they're being paid and for how long, and that's Jack. And I don't think there's any debate about what Jack is. It's Nico, and I don't think there's any debate about what Nico is, and he'll be up for a deal in a year or so that'll need a bit of work. And then the third one's Luke, and maybe Luke's the one that has the question mark just by virtue of being the youngest and least experienced, and maybe less of a blue chip NHL year-over-year track record. But if Luke turns out to be what Fitzy's paying him to be, those are 3 really good pieces to build around. And then similarly, it's just a matter of, complementing them with the right guys and finding that window. And maybe it's, shedding another contract or 2, which I think will be a lot easier to do this summer than right now. I know, like your point about fans locally maybe being up in arms with what's happened in the last few weeks. Like, there's players, and I'm not not judging the player, but a player like Dougie Hamilton, for example, who's a $9 million cap hit and has a huge signing bonus on July 1st of next year. After that, he becomes, I believe, like a $4 or $5 million cash liability on a $9 million hit. So, July 2nd, 2026, if Dougie's open to being moved, to teams under his no move, there'll be a lot more appetite from other clubs to take on an asset like that than there would be today, with that money coming due, and maybe that'll be a better window for the Devils to make sort of the type of ads that fans are hoping for, as opposed to in season, where it's always a little bit tougher than in the off season.
Yeah, for sure. I've always thought that if something with Dougie Hamilton was going to happen, it's probably more of a summer move, just more flexibility there. But listen, you've been in these rooms for these negotiations before. Just give us a peek behind the curtain, whether it's a trade or if it's trying to reel in a free agent. Especially because when you were with the Panthers, they weren't necessarily a destination yet. They are now. And Tom Fitzgerald has said over and over again he wants to make New Jersey a destination. But just how difficult is it to? And if it's a 2-part answer because they're perhaps two different types of negotiations. How hard is it to, reel in a free agent to come play for your team and help them take that next step? And versus, how difficult is it to pull off one of these trades? I mean, you see with the kind of hurdles that, Tom Fitzgerald has to kind of jump through now or jump over now to move some of these players with no move clauses. How difficult can this be?
Listen, it takes a lot of prep work, and the cap element is as important as sort of the player for player talent element. And I know, looking back to my own work, and one of these deals was with New Jersey, with Tom and Ray. In 2016, for example, I was looking at our cap portfolio of players and contracts, and we realized we really wanted to sign our young core to long-term extensions. And at that time, that core was Barkov, Huberdeau, Riley Smith, who I'd traded for the year before, Trocheck, who was up for an extension, Ekblad. And we also wanted to really add and make some big moves. And to do that, we had to do a couple of things. And one of them was we had inherited Dave Bolland's contract. And listen, Dave had a great career, won cups in Chicago, gave everything his body had. At the time he was in Florida, he was a little closer to the back nine of his career. And we had 4 more years of him at like a 5.5 cap hit. And so we knew we had to move out that contract. And to do that, we didn't have an easy out, just like Jersey might not have with a couple other pieces right now. And it really took me a whole summer of day in, day out calls to John Chaika, who was running the Coyotes, until we structured a really creative deal that ended up being a deal that cost us a recent first-round pick. But it did get that contract off our books. And we also structured a deal where I sat with Kenny Holland, off the draft floor in 2016 for 2.5 hours trying to put together a convoluted deal that involved Bolden's contract for, I believe it was Datsuk had sort of quote unquote retired at the time, for his contract coming back. And, deals like that are not easy to make. It's fun to play fantasy hockey, and those fantasy hockey deals sometimes happen. But it takes a long time. There needs to be a lot of buy-in, especially on those weird deals where there's cash and not players involved, depending on ownership. Getting sign off, you need to make sure medicals are okay. A lot needs to be done. Second part of your question about attracting free agents, your point is correct. We weren't a destination at that time, far from it. And so it was really a personal pitch. Jonathan Marchessault, for example, was a player who I looked at with our R&D group and said, hey, this guy's in Tampa. He's not getting a ton of ice time, but he's producing a lot in his opportunity. And he's sort of been a gamer at every level of junior and in the queue and everywhere on the way up. He's a guy we want to sign and we want to make a real big bet on. And to sort of translate that to Jonathan, I flew down to New York. I met with him there. But I also had our owners have breakfast with him, which sounds absurd for a player who was making league minimum, who'd become a Group 6 UFA that no one in the league wanted, that had been cut loose by Tampa. And I had, Vinny Viola, our owner, and I sat with Jonathan in New York, had breakfast, and we said very clearly, like, Jonathan, we aren't seeing you as a, AHL, NHL tweener. We're going to offer you a 2-year one-way deal, but we actually see you as being a potential top line, top 6 forward. And you might say, well, wait a minute, why would you tell a player that? You could turn around and say, okay, I want $5 million, but that's not really how it works. And we sort of knew what the market was going to be, given that he was Group 6, having spoken with his agent as well. And that made an impression on him. And he had a couple similar offers, but no one else was telling him that. And no one else was having owners flying in to meet with guys who would play on the fourth line. And, he turns around the next year and scores 30 goals for us. And then, foolishly was let go on expansion, which is a different story, but goes on to win a Conn Smythe trophy. And, that personal touch matters. And again, going back to the point about Fitzy being, very well-connected, well-liked, well-established guy in the hockey world, like, that soft power is useful, and it does come into play, especially in free agency, but also on trades when you have players with a no-trade clause of, to the extent you can talk to a player before trading for him. Having people who are trusted and believable and likable certainly helps.
Yeah, certainly. And I do know that, Fitzgerald is well liked, but, just thinking about some of these negotiations, like, you look at this summer, how long it took him to get, Luke Hughes nailed down. And last year it took him a bit of time to get Dawson Mercer nailed down. These are restricted free agents who, they couldn't sign elsewhere at the time unless they wanted to sign an offer sheet, but both of those players weren't eligible. Just how grinding could those restricted free agent contracts become that they sometimes extend into training camp, or they perhaps take some time away from them even in the regular season? We saw that with William Nylander a couple of years ago with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Just how grinding are those RFA negotiations when it comes to a player of significance like those guys that we just previously mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I would push back a little here. I wouldn't describe like a lack of talent or desire or initiative on the fact that the team didn't sign the player until a later date. I think part of the answer here is it really does depend a little bit on the player, but very much so on the agent you're dealing with. I think about the negotiation I did with Eustace King and Steve Rich, who were the O2K agency who represented Vincent Trocheck, and I sat down with those guys early in the year of Vince's RFA platform year, and was like, "Hey, Vince is playing well. I'd like to sign him to a 3-year deal." And they're like, "Uh huh." A couple weeks later, like, "Hey, we really like to push forward on Vince." They're like, "Okay, well, we see him as comps to these players," and then a month later, he's got a few more goals. Well, we're going to wait and see, and that deal got done, I think, the week of the draft. Ended up being a 6-year deal at 4.75. Beginning of the talks, we were talking something about a 3-year deal at the mid threes, where I think way back when, keep me honest, I think it was like Johnson, Palat, and a couple other guys were in that range way back then. But the point was, like, some agents take their time, and those deals take a lot of time. Conversely, Aaron Ekblad's 8-year deal that I signed with Jeff Jackson was his agent for 7.5 a year, which was done right before the draft in 2016 as well. That deal got done in like a week. And there was a narrative at the time that like Florida didn't know what they were doing, that we had a computer program that told us how to do contract negotiations, and we rushed in and we overpaid this player massively. And I was just sitting back laughing at all of that, because in reality, to your point, we weren't a destination market. We very clearly, in discussions from ownership all the way on down, we're like, Aaron is a franchise level defenseman. We need to get him 8 years. The cap is going up. We're at risk of an offer sheet because of some other moves we were planning in that off season. And if we can sign him right now, that lets us pull those other strings. So that deal came together quickly for strategic reasons, but also, who we were dealing with. So yeah, the answer, it takes time. And then there's also like a very inside baseball dynamic where if there are RFAs, especially arbitration eligible ones, the NHLPA will put a little bit of light pressure on an agent to sort of set the market on certain players, or maybe hold off on others. I don't think it's a coincidence that Kirill Kaprizov signs a groundbreaking cap-breaking deal before Connor McDavid takes way below his market value. That sequencing probably wasn't totally coincidental, even though those players aren't comparable, just because McDavid is who he is. But anyway, yeah, lots of reasons. Timing has a lot of factors that go into it, and I'd say it's more important, what the term and number is than sort of the date of the signing.
Yeah, I hear that. And, just thinking about when some of these players are eligible for, these clauses in their contract, right? Right now, one of the narratives around Tom Fitzgerald is he's guilty of having some of the most trade clauses in his negotiations that he signed off on. I believe he's tied for first with the Carolina Hurricanes and the Edmonton Oilers for 15 no move, no trade clauses, combination wise, on his roster. So he takes a lot of heat for that. Is this a necessary evil for a market like New Jersey, or are they being handed out maybe a little bit too liberally? How do you navigate those waters?
It's a little bit of supply and demand, right? Depends on the player, not necessarily the market as much as just who you're going after and at what time, and what their leverage is. I think there are clubs, and you've named a couple. I could probably point to a couple more if I had to, who are probably too liberal in terms of giving the wrong players those trade protections. You always should look at like what's your best alternative to negotiating that deal, and oftentimes if you're having to negotiate a no move clause or a really onerous no trade on a player who isn't necessarily a blue chip signing, then you might need to get away from that, because the cost of getting out from that deal, or the inability to do so, becomes so far, so much more prohibitive down the line than you anticipate at the time of the signing, and vice versa. Having the trade flexibility becomes so much more valuable. And using the Florida analogy, I know when I signed Jonathan Huberdeau to a 6-year deal that expired in 2023, there was a lot of back and forth with his agent, who was Alan Walsh, pushing for no trade and no move protection. And we gave Jonathan some of that at the beginning of the deal, but I was very clear at the time with our owners, and they agreed not to give no trade protection on the back end of the deal in the event we wanted to monetize his contract. And at the time of the signing, that, a lot of people would have said, well, you're not going to trade Jonathan Huberdeau. He's your, 1A to Barkov, and just give him the no trade. You'll be fine. It turns out, fast forward 5 years, and the lack of a no trade in Huberdeau's 6th year is what by and large got Florida Matthew Tkachuk. And that's not necessarily something I anticipated in negotiating that contract specifically. But those type of situations arise. And the flip side of that is, if you sign a contract that doesn't age well, and even some of the best managers do that, and New Jersey does that too, not being able to get out of those contracts when you have some other, pretty thing coming your way that you didn't think was going to be there, it becomes very painful. And that's going to remain true even as the cap rises, because, contract values are going to rise as well.
I couldn't imagine what that pretty thing coming your way that you mentioned could have been for New Jersey at all. But no, I think we both saw how that panned out for the Devils recently. But you mentioned other incentives that you can negotiate into a deal to maybe perhaps get away from having to hand out a no move, no trade clause. What are some of those things that you can negotiate into a contract that might be appealing to a player, as opposed to taking that no move, no trade?
Yeah, I think what I was saying really is you have to look at the alternatives. That at some point, including those type of protections makes the acquisition cost too prohibitive, and that really
Okay.
depends on the market. There are players who will say, "Listen, I can get 5x5 with a no move. That's important to me. I have a young family, or I just really care about where I play." And if you don't give the player that trade protection or movement protection, you won't sign him because the offer's there. The question for you always has to be, well, are we okay not signing him because how do we value the cost of that no trade or the cost of that no move? And there's some signings out there that you can look at. And there's been some for backup goalies recently. I'm not talking about New Jersey here, but other teams that New Jersey may have been trying to trade with recently. But you look at those and you say, like, how could there not have been another asset out there to acquire without giving up that trade protection? Because that's going to be painful, because that contract may not age well, because there may be other assets you can acquire down the line. And that's always important. The ways to avoid giving out that trade protection, if you still want to get the player, often are either just, one, calling a bluff. And oftentimes you can look at the contract and say, okay, or a trade, or anything, and say, did that team really need to throw in that other second round pick in that trade? Or the other team really have not done it? Or, did this team really need to sign that player to a 15-team no trade? Would you really not have taken $8 million for 3 years if it was a 5-team or this or that? And that's player by player, dependent, and it depends on the desirability player and the market value. Ultimately, if you're negotiating with the same guy and you don't want to give that trade protection and you want to keep that player, really the only alternatives are A, giving them more salary, B, front loading it, C, giving them signing bonuses, or D, some other sort of behind the scenes other incentives that might help. But yeah, it's always case by case, and it's really just a judgment call at the time of, can we swallow this pill, or do we think we can win before it becomes a bigger problem?
Certainly, and right now, one of the things that the Devils are struggling with, and it's been reported that there might have been one or two trades vetoed on their end. So, nothing has been made official in terms of who it was. But you think of guys like Dougie Hamilton and Andre Palat, who have not 10-team no trade clauses, but 10-team trade clauses, where essentially the other 21 teams in the NHL are not, they're not going to approve to. They'll only approve 10 destinations. When a player gets a clause like that in their contract, is it true? Because there's this narrative that they're essentially looking at the rest of the league and saying, okay, I'm going to put these 10 teams on my contract because they can't make a move for my salary right now. Is that part of something that they do when they submit these lists every summer, or however often they submit their no or their 10-team trade lists or something of that sort?
I think it depends on the player. I think that's probably a less common outcome. The more common outcome might just be, maybe cities in a country the player doesn't want to go to, or high tax jurisdictions, or whatnot. Certainly, players and agents can be difficult and strategic, especially if you're asking for a list mid-year or whatever, and trying to narrow that universe down by saying, hey, you can only trade me to these 5 non-playoff teams that have no cap hits. From my experience, that's less common, and often it's just a matter of, like, practically speaking, players who are in that situation are often ones where, like, both the player and team recognize a change, if possible, to certain places is probably mutually beneficial. And they can have those conversations about working together. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, but typically, you sign a free agent to a contract, he has no trade protection. You ask him for his list the next day, and it's, hey, these are the places I don't want to go, not here are the places I don't think you'll be able to move me to.
And you mentioned, the tax jurisdictions. Just when talking about, and obviously, the Florida Panthers have an advantage there, or people like to say they have an advantage there. Is that prevalent in negotiations? Are players looking at, hey, this is a no tax state, more money in my pocket? Or are there other incentives out there like, hey, New Jersey has an airport in their backyard. The travel is not that bad. Do they weigh those pros and cons when choosing a team, right? Is the tax thing as prevalent as some people say it is?
It helps. Again, it's all case by case, right? Like, certain players who have maybe, come off their major UFA deal might just say, I want to win, or I want to be closer to home, or I want to play with my countrymen, or for this coach or that. It's really case by case. For a player coming up for a big deal, it for sure helps if you can structure a deal with tax optimal characteristics and put more money in the player's pocket and give them more upfront and this and that. And some plays, but yeah, players want to play, on good teams with good coaches where other players say this is a nice place to go. Those things all matter, and it's just widely varies based on who you're talking to and where they are in their careers. And flipping it around, like, doing all those things do matter as a club. If you're saying what, like, the best way to look at that is to invert it and to say, like, if we give our players really bad food and fly them on really cheap airplanes, and don't take care of their wives or significant others, will that make it harder for us to attract and retain talent? And the answer is, like, oh, obviously, right? So
Right.
then doing everything the right way matters too.
Certainly, and it's one of those things that I think the Devils actually do really well is take care of the players once they have them there. So I think that's what's working out for Fitzgerald in his favor in terms of keeping some of these guys he's acquired. But last one for me here, Steve, and I really appreciate you taking the time today, the day after Christmas. Which happy holidays, by the way. I appreciate you once again coming on to the Devils Rink Report. But you mentioned earlier having a hand in the Jonathan Marchessault negotiations. Not sure how much of a pulse you had on it, 2 summers ago, but there was talk that, he and New Jersey were talking and potentially, working towards possibly having a contract ink there. Any insight on how close maybe he was to choosing New Jersey before ultimately going to Nashville with Steven Stamkos?
I have not asked Marchie about it. I have absolutely no idea. Um, yeah, I think wherever he chose, it would have been a family decision given his growing brood of children. But yeah, I have no idea how close he was.
Not to put you on the spot there, just wondering if you had any insight. If we're not cheating, we're not trying here, right, Steve?
You got it.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. Great insight as always. We heard you on the Jeff Marek show a couple weeks ago, and that was just some excellent insight you provided there. And I really appreciate you coming on today and joining us with the Devils Rink Report, just to give the Devils fans some perspective on what's going on here for Tom Fitzgerald and how how to navigate these waters and how difficult it might be. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope to catch up with you again in the future.
You got it. Thanks, James. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Steve Werier, former AGM of the Florida Panthers, who joined us earlier today, and now you just get to hang out with me again. So sorry about a little bit earlier. I cut to the interview a little sooner than I anticipated. I had a tickle in my throat that was literally debilitating. I couldn't get past it. But here we are. We're back. We're good. So that was Steve Werier, former AGM of the Florida Panthers, who provided some great perspective on things. There's a narrative that is out there right now of, oh, no tax states are easier to reel players in. And he said, look, of course, certainly that is a factor in some cases, but this is really a person by person, player by player situation that these not every player thinks that way. And it also turns out that with the no move, no trade contracts or sorry clauses that the players get. Again, it's person by person, player by player. And I did see a few comments on, oh, why do certain players have, and we'll get to those a little bit later. But no less. Look, the Devils have some work to do here. The trade freeze or the roster freeze ends on Sunday at midnight, meaning Saturday night, I guess, if you're still one of those people who are awake from Saturday before midnight to Saturday after Sunday at midnight, which will be the first minute of Sunday, is when the freeze lifts, and that's when teams can start making moves again. So, look, there's been a lot of question as to whether the Devils will be one of those teams. You had, Elliot Friedman saying the other day on the Fan Hockey Show that, he sees that being one of the teams who you have to keep an eye on, just because of their own circumstances. Look, the Devils have Jonathan Kovacevic coming back in the new year. The new year is in Czech's watch 5 days. So look, if he's going to come back in 5 days, that's still up for question. He might need a little bit longer than the 5 day window, but he is coming back no less, and the Devils are going to have to clear some cap room in order to make that happen. There is another way that they can do it with certain roster transactions. They might need to play with, I think it's something like 21 players on the roster instead of 23 every night. So we'll see if that is something that ends up having to happen as opposed to making a move. But right now they're currently 390K over the cap. Nemitz is a guy who still has to come back as well, so he's going to be on the up against the cap again. This morning or a couple days ago, you saw um, Pierre LeBrun play matchmaker and had Steven Stamkos go to the Devils. That's a fit that he likes for Steven Stamkos if he moves at all. But that's something that you wonder if it could happen. And like, look, is Nashville a team that Dougie Hamilton will be open to going to? Um, Certainly, they're not going to compete right now. And does the do the Predators have the appetite to acquire a guy like him at $9 million if they're not going to be competing? Maybe they see themselves as better than they are right now, and perhaps they need a blue liner, and that's what they're going to think of for the next 2 years when they have him. We don't really know what's going on in the mind of Barry Trotz, but you do wonder if there is a spot that we're not thinking of for Hamilton to go, if he does end up getting traded. Now, like you heard from Steve Werier earlier in the interview, he says that he thinks that's more of a summer thing. I pretty much feel the same way. I mean, I do know that the Devils have tried, but in season for other teams, it's probably too hard, right? The Devils, of course, want to move on from this contract. Um, but it's difficult to do right now, and the reason is just because of how the no trade clause is structured, where he has 10 teams that he can choose to go to, and he's just not budging on those right now. So we'll see. Palat hasn't even been approached. That's something that those are words that came from him. um so we'll see what happens there. But again, I just thought it was interesting to hear from Steve's perspective. Like, look, the Panthers, when I was with them, were not a destination yet, and sometimes those things that you have to do are, it depends on the market, depends on the player, depends on, like, look, are we gonna lose this guy if he's gonna not get the no trade protection that he wants, and he's going to go somewhere else? Yeah, maybe it's possible. So you might have to cough up a little bit to get something. And for a team like the Devils, like, look, right now the Devils are not a destination like the Florida Panthers are, right? They have a decent sized tax jurisdiction that is a factor. They also have, an airport in their backyard and some of the best travel in their league, in the league. So is that a factor too? Yeah, sometimes those things are a factor. Is it a good place for, veteran guys to raise a family? Yeah, it is. If you're going to be, leaving Newark and going out to like the West Oranges or something like that, or maybe even, over to Hoboken, which is, by the way, a train ride away from New York City, where you're going to see Jack Hughes and Tate McRae hanging out in the city. So, there are certainly things in the Devils' corner when it comes to these negotiations. But, when it comes to a team like the Rangers, who maybe, a team like the Devils is bidding against, they're going to say, if I'm going that close to the city, why not just become a Ranger? Well, they're not given the trade protection, and the Rangers, sorry, and the Devils are. So, yeah, maybe I'll be more comfortable being able to ensure that I can stay where I want to longer than if I have to trade, or get traded. So, look, there's no excuses here, right? Obviously, Fitzgerald has backed himself into a corner, and you got some perspective there from Steve Werier, who I think was fantastic, and I was so grateful to get him on today. He shed some very great insight on, just a peek behind the curtain with some of these things, and how these things they operate. I mean, you heard him talk about how it took him days to get certain deals done, whereas it took hours to get another one done. I mean, these things can just change so quickly at the pickup of a phone, and the first dial could be the last, and the last dial could be the 15th. So it's tough, sometimes, and other times it's a bit easier. So all right, Sean, let's get to some fan questions, and then we're gonna wrap it up for today. So we got a couple starred here. I believe we got five or six. We got a handful, and then we're gonna be on our way on this Friday, Boxing Day, and the day after Christmas. But Sean, let's get the first question up on the board from Jay Snow, who says, "I really think it's time to break this core up. We're going on to, or sorry, into year three since 22-23, and this team has regressed." Um, Man, it's interesting, right? You're only breaking up the core, and when I say breaking up the core, I really don't think that you're breaking up trading everyone, right? Do I think that Jack Hughes is going anywhere? No, I don't. I don't even see him signing with the Wild in however many years. I know that that's been floated out there. So no, he's not going anywhere. Do I see Nico Hischier going anywhere? No, they weren't going to include him in the deal for Quinn Hughes. So no, he's not going anywhere either. So who does that leave? That leaves Timo Meyer. That leaves Jesper Bratt. Luke Hughes is another one, by the way. He's not going anywhere. So who does that leave? Timo Meyer, Jesper Bratt. Those are two guys who you could say to yourself, look, we're going to dangle them. We're going to see what we have. I don't think Jesper Bratt is going anywhere, if I'm being honest. I do know. Look, he has a full no move clause. And like I said earlier in the show, we spoke to him. He's just up against it right now. Even Sheldon Keefe admitted he's going through it a bit. But, he's still doing everything else elite in that sense. So, um, look, if you're breaking up the core, I understand the sentiment. You're only doing that though to add someone else to the roster of significance, kind of like how the Wild just did. Not to say that the guys that they traded were core players, but you're trading potential future core pieces for a core piece that's coming back. So look, I know these are fantasy trades and we talk about them like they're so easy to speak on, but when you're trading a Jesper Bratt, you better make sure, or if you're trading Jesper Bratt, you better make sure that you're getting back a Brady Kachuk, something of that kind of volume, just so that, look, yes, if you have to move two players, right? Because Jesper Bratt's not going to reel in Brady Kachuk alone. You might have to throw Simone Nemeth into that deal, and not to say that Brady Kachuk is even available. Again, we're just playing fantasy GM here, but if you're trading Jesper Bratt, you better get a Brady Kachuk in return. And that means that you're adding a guy like Simone Nemeth and draft picks to get a Brady Kachuk. And is that going to make the Devils better? Up front, yeah, it probably will make them a little bit better. You're going to lose the services of a distributor in Jesper Bratt. Can he return to 30 goal form? Say if he goes to the Ottawa Senators, maybe. I don't see why not. I think he's just a bit snake bitten this year, and it's been a rough go for him. We were all loving Jesper Bratt last year when he, collected the most points he has in his career to that point. But if you're going to make a major move like that, make a major shakeup, you better hope that you're doing it for the right player, and that's a guy like, again, Brady Kachuk. So it's not easy. It's not as easy as it sounds, and I understand wanting to do it. But look, by no means do I think that this team is in no man's land right now. There are good pieces. They just need to make the right ads, and I know that they're a bit handcuffed, but if they do, I think that they're going to be okay. And look, this time last year, we were talking about how great the Devils were. They went into the holiday break on fire, and then when they came back from the holiday break, they kind of lost it, and they dwindled a bit. Who's to say that they can't do the reverse of that this year? We'll see what happens. Sean, bring up the next one, please. Another one from Jay Snow says the problem with Luke is you thought his offense would be there this year. At least he's struggled in the defensive zone even worse. And yes, I do understand that. And one of the things I wrote about the other night is he's having a really hard time finding shooting lanes from the point. So that's a problem, but he has to figure that out. It's just something he has to work through. He's not going to get an opportunity to fix that watching from above. Nobody's going to scratch him. He's doing other things well too. But again, look, he's back with Pesci for 2, 3 games now. And I think overall he's been a lot better. I mean, he did a lot of really good things against the Islanders where he was transitioning the puck really well. He was quarterbacking not the power play, but he was quarterbacking some of the offensive zone time. And again, it just came down to getting pucks through to the net. Simone Nemetz has figured out how to do that well. They're kind of missing that a little bit with him out of the lineup. But I understand the sentiment, right? He has struggled, but for the majority of the season, he's played on his offside and he's had to lift other guys up with him. He's a third year guy who missed training camp. I think you're looking at a guy who he got started behind the 8 ball this season, and he's trying to catch up every day. I forget who I spoke to last year, but when you miss time in the beginning, you're just trying to play catch up for the rest of the year. So was it ideal that he missed? No. Is it on him? Kind of. I mean, you also heard Steve Werier talk about how you're dealing a lot with the GM, and it's kind of on them too. Um, but again, this is not to say that they have time for to waste another year on Luke Hughes's development, but overall he will be okay. Let's get to a few more here, Sean. What else we got? At Devil Heaven says, how long can we not be cap compliant? Right now, you have to be cap compliant as soon as, like, right now. If you are over the cap, that means that you have to dress X amount of players to be up to the cap for that game. So let's say the 23 players you're going to, sorry, not 23, the 20, how many play in a game? My goodness, I can't math right now. I'm still in holiday mode. 12, 6, 2. So if you can't dress 21 players because of cap purposes, that means you're dressing like, let's just say, for instance, it's 20 players to get to that 82.5 million threshold. I don't even know what the cap is right now. Is it 95.5 million? Yeah, 95.5 million. So to get to the 95.5 million cap, salary cap for the game, you have to say perhaps sit Dawson Mercer for a game because you're over $4 million, right? If that's how you want to get Kovacevic back in the lineup, you got to sit Dawson Mercer. He just can't play because his cap is over. So that's how it works right now. If you're over the cap, you got to get down to the 95.5 million. And that means that guys can't play. You have to scratch guys. So you can't be over the cap at all in season. What else do we got here? Sean, Rick Roma says, how the hell does Dadonov get a no trade clause? Listen, he was a guy who he was supposed to be a stopgap guy. He can score, play with the Jesper Bratts and Jack Hugheses of the Devils, and he just can't stay healthy. And the reason why he got a no trade clause was it was probably between the Devils and another team, and they said, "Look, we'll give you some trade protection. You'll stay here for the whole year, and you don't have to worry about it." And that was appealing to him. So the idea was to have him play in the top six, and also, he was supposed to kind of be a mentor for Gritsuk, and that's what they were hoping for. Unfortunate that they can't do that right now. When he'll be back, we're really not sure. We'll see after the holiday break. One or two more here, Sean, and then we'll get going here. Jay Snow says, "Does Steve see the Devils being able to make any significant trades this year?" I talked about him with this. I talked about this with him. Sorry, a little bit off camera. It didn't come up in the flow of conversation on camera, but he does think that they can make moves. It's just going to take a little bit of creativity, and he does believe that Fitzgerald has that creativity in him. He just doesn't know necessarily what that looks like right now. So he does think that they can do it. He knows that they've already tried. We all know that they've already tried. It's just going to, again, take a little bit of creativity. So we'll see how they can pivot to possibly being able to make that happen. What else we got here, Sean? I'm liking O'Reilly and not Stammer from at Devil's Heaven 77. Yeah, I see that a lot. I see a lot of people looking at O'Reilly as opposed to Steven Stamkos. I just think that right now, unfortunately for the Devils, O'Reilly doesn't want to move, whereas Stamkos might be a little bit more open to the possibility. So one guy wants to be part of the solution in Nashville. The other guy is saying to himself, well, my clock is running out maybe a little bit faster. So I'm certainly open to, maybe moving on from this and, figuring out my situation position elsewhere. We'll see what happens. But all right, and that's going to wrap it up for us today, Sean. So thank you so much for joining us today on this Friday, December 26th edition of the Devils Rink Report. This was the last one of the year, guys. So thank you so much for being a part of it in year one. I mean, obviously, it's not a full year yet, right? We started in October, but thank you for being a part of the first calendar year of Devils Rink Report. We really appreciate you joining us here. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please be sure to do so. The more you help us, the more we will provide for you. And like we said, we're on the truck to 1,000 subs. And if you like this kind of content, we're hoping to bring it to you on podcast platforms. So if you want to see us on podcast platforms, subscribe here. That's our goal. Hit 1,000 here, and we're going to go on the RSS feed. So if you want to see us or hear us in your cars, subscribe to the channel, please. And the more you help us, the more we can help you. Devils Rink Report. James Nichols here via New Jersey Hockey Now. Devils play tomorrow, by the way, against the Washington Capitals at home. You know, I'll be there covering the game. And listen, if anything comes up, who knows if a surprise stream will happen, right? Maybe I'll hop on the microphone and, if anything is necessary. So until next time, everybody, thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you again next week.